will need a European response, or a Europe that is stronger, more sovereign, more capable of dealing with its own problems, and more capable of kind of defending itself physically, but also kind of sticking up for its own needs in the China relationship. And I think that's something where it's actually then pretty basic in how you prepare for this, is by kind of closing the gaps on your defense infrastructure at the moment, by making sure that you spend enough money on Ukraine, by making sure that you kind of ramp up your defenses when it comes to the distortions that are created by China's trade practices, that you ramp up European unity, that you create a commission that is strong enough to actually deal with all of these questions with capable personnel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Kelly. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff University in lovely Wales in the United Kingdom. I'm also an associate in research at Harvard University's Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and most importantly, a fellow with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations Public Intellectuals Program. I'm very pleased, very excited to host our conversation today, and I'm pleased to introduce our guests for today's interview exploring EU-China relations. Very briefly, because their full bios are available on our website, I'll start with Noah. Noah Barkin is a senior advisor in Rhodium Group's China practice and a visiting senior fellow in the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Janka Oertel is director of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. So welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for being here. We'll just jump right into the questions. So we'll start kind of big picture, and we'll start with Janka first, and then we'll go to Noah afterwards. What were your big kind of top line takeaways from Xi Jinping's recent visit to Europe? He was there from May 6th to May 10th, I believe, his first since 2019 that he was in Europe. What were your big takeaways, and did anything surprise you from the visit?
So I think it is important to see it also in the connection with the preceding visit of Chancellor Scholz to China. So I think it's sort of an all-encompassing one, and I think we should kind of discuss that together. And while that Scholz trip was very much kind of dominated by fear, almost, it was very timid, it was very careful, it was very cautious, it was trying to relax the relationship more. Xi's visit to Europe was really not dominated by any signs of panic on the Chinese side. The kind of confidence was there on the Chinese side that the EU is sort of not united enough to really cause serious problems to China in the long run when it comes to broader strategic objectives. And it was more designed to sort of cover and get over the short-term headaches that current EU policies can create for Xi Jinping's China at the moment, for the leadership in kind of relevant, particularly in relevant sectors, particularly in the trading relationship. So I think that was, for me, it was sort of a sign of a relatively confident Chinese leader having no problem sitting down with the French president and listening to the demands of the EU Commission president, but at the same time then ending the visit on a high note, leaving from Hungary with a smile and the kind of the knowledge that in Europe there are close friends of China, and sort of if you want to put it together, maybe it's like it was like you say bookended on both sides. You had like the Scholz visit and the Hungary visit, so it was kind of comfortably in the middle in a way.
Yeah, were you surprised by any of that, or is that roughly in line with what your expectations were before the visit?
I think it is astonishingly in line with the expectations, which is almost a bit scary sometimes, because I do wake up every once in a while and think, not only about Scholz surprised me, but also about Xi Jinping surprised me today. I really greatly appreciate that. No, but it was without any jokes, it was not full of surprises. This was very much anticipated and expected. Anyone who expected anything differently probably hasn't been watching too closely.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Noah, well, how about you? What were your impressions or any surprises?
Well, I agree with Janka that this was, well, first of all, that you have to look at this together, the Xi's visit together with the Scholz visit to Beijing, which happened about 3 weeks beforehand. I think it was very important for Macron and von der Leyen to be talking to Xi together. So I did think it was important that in Paris, at least, there was sort of a collective message that was sent. on trade, on China's support for Russia. But I think the broad message, and I think Janka was saying similar, more one of European disunity than one of unity, and that was not so much because of Hungary and Serbia. I mean, we know that Hungary and Serbia are probably the two countries in Europe that are closest to China. But it was this, Schultz going there 3 weeks before, and then, Macron dining with Schultz literally days before Xi Jinping was coming to Paris and sort of trying to convince him in a Paris restaurant to come along. It just wasn't very good optics. It just showed Europe sort of scrambling. I mean, on the whether there were any surprises, I was actually a little surprised by the messages that Schultz sent in public. We don't know what was said behind closed doors, but I found the messages, especially on China, Russia, very mild, especially as his trip was sort of bookended by the trips by Janet Yellen and Antony Blinken to Beijing, sending very strong messages about, the transfer of dual-use goods from China to Russia, which are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine. I expected at least a message in public from Schultz saying this is of serious concern to Germany and to Europe, and I didn't hear that. So for me, that was a bit of a surprise.
Maybe I'm just more cynical than Noah. That may be it already.
I'm not sure if that's possible, Janka.
The other bookend is obviously the Putin trip to China that is happening basically as we speak. So that's sort of the end of the big China-Europe conversation, I would say.
Yeah, we'll have to do another
4 or 5 bookends.
That's right. It's our whole bookshelf going on here. We'll have to have another conversation once that trip is wrapped up. Noah, let's stick with you, and I'll ask kind of another big picture question. Another big theme to talk about is within the European Union itself. So obviously, many different diverse contexts, national contexts. Each nation has its own interests, its own political considerations, its own domestic politics. So there are understandable differences on China policy within the EU, some of which you just touched on. Where do you think these divisions stand today, and what are the implications for these divisions for the EU's ability to develop a coherent China policy as a collective?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we have come a long way. I think there is a greater consensus on China than there was a few years ago. I think the pandemic obviously had a big impact, but especially China's positioning on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Germany has a new, well, it's not so new, came out with a China strategy last July, which puts the emphasis on de-risking, diversification, reducing dependencies. We've seen the 16+1 format, now 14+1 sort of disintegrate before our eyes. And the Commission, of course, with the support of the member states, has built up a defensive toolbox, which it is now deploying. But I think the past few weeks have sort of underscored that there's still ways to go, that the consensus in Europe is still fragile. And I think, Germany, we talked about Schultz's visit, Germany is reverting to old habits, I would say, prioritizing sort of short to medium term interests of a handful of industries, ignoring perhaps longer term economic and security challenges. There is a lot of angst right now about the weakness in the German economy. And I think the response from the Chancellery has been to sort of cling to what has worked in the past rather than acknowledge that we're sort of moving into a new world and we need a change of strategy. There isn't a Franco-German consensus on China. I think that was pretty clear over the coming weeks. And while the Franco-German motor isn't what it used to be in Europe, I think if Paris and Berlin are not on the same page, it makes it more difficult to move forward on these big foreign policy challenges. Is there reason to be? I've read a lot of headlines in recent days about Hungary, the Trojan horse. Is there reason to be concerned about that? Perhaps, but I think really, if the big states are pulling in the same direction, I'm not as worried about Hungary. And then maybe a final point. We're entering, I would say, a sort of precarious period, a change of the European Commission, EU elections next month, followed by a change of the Commission, the US election, and a period of rising trade tensions between the EU and China. And I think it's going to be a test for whether Europe can hold together, especially this investigation into electric vehicles and the debate about imposing duties on electric vehicle imports from China. We've seen over the last weeks, also on the trips, some different messages being sent, particularly sort of Germany on the one side, the Commission and France on the other. So it will be important for Brussels, Paris, and Berlin to stick together on this and reach a consensus. Otherwise, Europe is going to end up weakened, and all the progress that we've made over recent years is going to be undermined.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So Janka, sticking with this theme of coherence and cohesiveness and an EU strategy, like Noah was saying, you're in your recent book, The End of the China Illusion, which came out in 2023. Everyone should take a look, especially if you read German, because it's in German, if I'm not mistaken. You call for a rethink on Europe's approach to relations with China. Do you think this rethink is happening? And if so, where, or even if not, where do you think the conversation should go to achieve this rethink?
So while I was writing the book, there were these moments where I thought, does anyone need this still? We're on the right track, right? This is going well. There's the China strategy and everyone's thinking about this now. And the Europeans are actually really clear about where things are going. And particularly in Germany, there seems so much going on and so much to happen. And I was a bit doubtful whether this still needed that kind of strong reminder. And I wanted to write something for a public audience, sort of saying things have changed. And if the China strategy says China has changed and therefore we need to change, then we sort of should explain how China has changed. And I think the last few weeks and months have been a good reminder of why that was still quite necessary, that we're not very honest with ourselves about the debate, that we're still trying to have our cake and eat it most of the time, that there is still this illusion that in the end it will be all right, at least for us, which I think is a very German thing, because in the end, all of the crises in the past have been sort of all right, at least for us. And we haven't cared that much what the impact has been on the rest of the Europeans. And so I think this is, again, one of those where we are having to realize that what we are actually in right now is a real crisis situation, is a triage moment that would require absolute leadership, absolute focus, and close coordination with all allies and partners that we can find, that we're talking about months and not years when it comes to our economic competitiveness in realms like the electric vehicle sector. And it does feel like the inertia has set in of either saying, well, what are we supposed to do about it? We can't do anything about this anyway. And look at Ukraine and Trump and Gaza and whatever. We can't deal with this. This is too much. Or at the same time, this thinking of, let's just keep doing what we're doing. It will be okay. And I think somewhere in the middle between that needs to be a really, really realistic policy approach. And we have sort of lost that narrative of reasonableness and prudence. It does seem like doing it how we did it in the good old days seems to be the prudent and reasonable way of dealing with a very, very new challenge. And that in itself seems to be very illogical. So I think what needs to change is a real assessment of the trade-offs that are happening, having a really blunt conversation about what is at risk and what is at stake. And I think, as Noah has pointed out, the conversation about China's support for Russia needs to happen. I think the sentence that China currently is a strategic enabler of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine is a sentence that European policymakers still have a hard time saying, but it is something that we can empirically show. And so I think it's time to shed those illusions as well.
Well, just a quick follow-up. What do you think is required or would be helpful to force that conversation, to shift away from this inertia that has set in?
So I think in a certain way, the Chinese economy and the Chinese leadership is helping the Europeans doing that, because by so aggressively pushing for market dominance in the sectors that are also considered the growth motors for the European economy, I think a lot of people have realized, oh, hang on, this is not just about something benign and something far away. This is going to hit home pretty soon and pretty close. And I think this realization of we're going to lose jobs, we're going to go through our own China shock here if we don't do anything about it. And now this is entering this really uncomfortable zone for those free trade fancying Europeans that are all very kind of worried about the fact that the US administration is putting 100% tariffs. That number alone, whether it's reasonable or not, doesn't matter, but it freaks out everyone in Europe to talk about 100% tariffs. And so I think it is important that we can go into those zones where it hurts a little bit and trying to understand that the speed with which the challenge is coming at us and the scale at which it is coming at us requires really unprecedented senses of urgency across the entirety of the continent.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So Janka, I'm gonna stick with you. I have a second follow-up. You both mentioned the China strategy in Germany. So I want to ask a quick question about that. Although your answer just now kind of foreshadowed perhaps how you might answer this. So lots has happened since Germany released its much anticipated China strategy in July 2023. Can you give us just a quick sense of how you think things are going with Germany's attempt to balance politics on the one hand with business on the other, and then more broadly, national interests with European interests when it comes to China policy?
So I think the China strategy was very strong in the analysis bit. What kind of China are we seeing? And that's a collective description of reality that this coalition government had seemingly agreed upon last summer. Now, if that collective description of reality still holds true, a couple of things follow from that. And I don't see how the logical connection is being made between the analysis of the kind of China we're seeing and the kind of responses that we would need to give to that. So I would say to really bring that China strategy to life and to make that endeavor, which was honestly very useful for its own sake, and just having that conversation across the ministries, having the conversations across society as well, just creating that strategy was an important process. But now if it has to live up to its potential, then a couple of shifts have to happen very quickly. And I think the kind of EV subsidy probe, as Noah has pointed out, is going to be one of those really tangible moments. If the German if the German position on this remains one that is detrimental to European interests and only positive for German short-term interests, then I think the German-China strategy will kind of be seen in a different light, also by those that have actually admired particularly the analytical bit of it and the analytical part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and we'll come to EVs in just a second, actually, because that's such an important issue. But before we do, Noah, I want to check in with you on Scholz's trip to China, which you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, April 13th to 16th. After that visit, you wrote that Europe's united front on China no longer includes Germany. Do you think, how serious is that, I guess is the question. Do you think Scholz's relatively soft stance on China really threatens the European Commission's foreign policy making? And if so, in what ways precisely?
Well, if I wrote that Europe's united front no longer includes Germany, I don't know what I was writing, because you can't have a united front without Germany. I think there is, if you're looking at the Commission and member states, there's on China especially, there's always an element of good cop, bad cop. The toolbox that the Commission built up over the last years and is now using quite aggressively, was done with the support, was put together with the support of the member states, including Germany. And there's a long tradition of member states sort of hiding behind the Commission or sort of pushing the dirty work onto Brussels. That said, I think we are, and we've been talking about this in a bit of a delicate period. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, has spent the last year sketching out a very ambitious agenda on China. We talked about the EV investigation and other trade measures that are being used. And she unveiled an economic security strategy about a year ago, which is still in the early stages of being implemented, and has been using very aggressive using other tools like the foreign subsidies regulation very aggressively in recent months to sort of level the economic playing field. I think I would expect the Commission to go even further than this. There is a sort of nascent debate about about trustworthiness criteria. So Margareta Vestager, the competition commissioner, gave a speech last month saying, basically, we have all these tools, but we're playing whack-a-mole. We need a more comprehensive approach based on data security, cybersecurity, environmental standards. So I think this is a debate which is coming. So I think there's a tolerance in Brussels these days, and that's where I would say the biggest change has come. Tolerance for a level of tension in the relationship with China that just wasn't there, and also a willingness to use Europe's economic leverage. And I think this is going to be a test. Will a country like Germany go along with this? I think there are certainly questions after Scholz's visit about whether he is ready to do so. Certainly, there's going to be a very intense debate behind closed doors about the use of all these tools and how to move further. And I think one final point, this is not just a conversation that's happening within the EU, it's happening at G7 level. I expect a very intense debate over the coming weeks in the build-up to the G7 summit in Italy, with the US pushing very aggressively for language in the G7 communique about overcapacities and the need to do whatever it takes, to use Mario Draghi's language, to push back and use all these tools. So it's going to be an interesting debate within the G7 as well as the EU. And I think probably with Germany on one side, the US on the other, and all the other countries somewhere in between.
Yeah. Okay. So let's stick with, I want to come back to EVs for a second, because you've both touched on data security, the issue of economic tensions and pushing back. So Janka, to you, with this issue of this onrush of Chinese electric cars, electric vehicles arriving in European ports, and all the concerns that come along with that about state sponsorship of, or state subsidies, really, of these Chinese manufacturing firms to produce electronic vehicles. How do you think policymakers in Brussels, and then also in key capitals like Berlin, how are they responding to this potential concern? I know you've written about this in the past. And how might these responses ultimately affect the relationship between China and the European Union, or these individual countries as well?
I think it's sort of important to look at the EV debate as kind of an example of a kind of challenge that is coming. I don't like to look at it in isolation, because I think that's precisely the problem that Margareta Vestager was describing when what Noah was saying about kind of the whack-a-mole playing that we hear.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it as similar to the 5G debate. Very similar to a question of, do we trust Chinese companies to form the backbone not only of our digital transition, but also of our green transformation? If the answer to that is yes, then we have no problem. Then we can welcome Chinese cars, Chinese vehicles in the European market. We can benefit from Chinese subsidies. European consumers can benefit in terms of cheap prices, high quality goods, and then that's fine. If we say we're not comfortable with that, because there are other elements to this, because there is a huge data security question to this, if the cars are in the market at scale, then if we're then talking about cameras and kind of the sensors that are inbuilt in those cars that can collect data because they are all training for automated driving. So if that is the case, then we need to think about what we're going to do to restrict some of the kind of onslaught, as it has been termed, onto the European market. And with measures taken in the US, but also in other countries, in India, in Japan, in Korea, etc., to safeguard their own industries and to safeguard their markets from overcapacities emanating from China, Europe will become the prime dumping ground, the prime area where these vehicles will enter the market. And we see that in the market shares already. And so this is something that is obviously of great concern for the Commission. This is why a probe has been initiated ex officio by the Commission itself. This is why there will be provisional measures already taken this summer. Probably in the next few weeks at some point, they will be announced what kind of duties might be imposed on a provisional basis. And then there will be a big discussion within the EU and with member states on how to deal with this on a more permanent basis, whether there is a solution when it comes to certain quotas, certain voluntary restraint questions, certain questions of how do you manage this kind of problematic trade relationship. And this is all as I said, really uncomfortable for Europeans because that's not the way we would like to do trade. But unfortunately, I think this is sort of the conditions that are being dictated at the moment by the way the markets have evolved and by how China is playing within those markets and how Chinese companies are playing within those markets. And so I think that's sort of the decision-making framework within which we find ourselves. And that holds true for a whole range of technologies. And that's why I think the trustworthiness debate is a really important one. And this main question of trust, what role, how much trust is there? In what sectors not, is I think the big debate we need to have. It's about kind of, is there more trust when it's a non-connected technology than if there is a connected technology? Where is it sort of, is the trade-off too high? Do we really need to produce all of our solar panels? Does that make us more economically secure? Or is it fine if there is just a threshold on inverters? These are all the very precise questions that now need to be answered, because in the abstract, we will not find a solution to kind of the problem that we're facing at the moment.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's a good point too about not trying to look at this problem from such a narrow perspective. This issue of trust is something that cuts across multiple industries and technologies, right? So it makes sense to think of it broadly, but also in terms of the minutia, the precision points that you're talking about.
And it's sort of different whether you talk about a refrigerator or a car, right? So I think we also need to start making this problem a bit smaller. That's not everything is the problem, but sort of the question is something consumer relevant or is it societally relevant? Where is the broad impact on society where the state as a regulator needs to come in, and where is it a consumer decision? And I would just like to kind of instigate a bit more of a discussion about that so that we leave the hyperbole on this, but sort of have a really honest conversation, because what the hyperbole has done, it has allowed policymakers also to hide behind that and not actually take on those very concrete questions right now.
Yeah, great point.
I would absolutely agree with that. And we heard Janka, Scholz's favorite expression, no decoupling, right? Which he's been saying, sort of a straw man. Nobody is really talking about decoupling at the moment. Some people may think that the Biden administration is on a slippery slope towards decoupling, but nobody has been advocating for a sort of far-reaching rupture from the Chinese economy for many years. There were a number of people in the Trump administration who obviously wanted that, but they're not in office anymore. So saying no decoupling, that doesn't really mean anything. It's really about de-risking and how you de-risk and where to set the red lines, as Janka was saying.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're running a little tight on time, but there are two big questions I want to make sure that we get to because they're so important. One is the war on Ukraine. So Noah, China's continued support for Russia continues to be obviously a significant point of tension in EU-China relations. And we spoke earlier about Putin's visit to Beijing today as we have this conversation. How did this issue play out during Xi's visit in your mind to Europe last week?
Well, we don't have all the details on what was said behind closed doors in Paris. I think the visits to Serbia and Hungary are largely irrelevant when it comes to China's policy towards Ukraine. I don't think the fact that Xi Jinping found comfort in his discussions with Orban and Vučić, for example, are going to have much impact on China's policy. But Europe has been growing increasingly concerned about Chinese support for Russia, which has picked up, right? I think the first year of the war, it was, I think the Chinese companies were very careful. There was a clear red line from Europe and the US in terms of direct military aid, arms. But it's over the last, 6 months to a year that more dual-use goods that have made it into Russia, and the EU has started putting Chinese entities on its sanctions list, just a handful, very very carefully after intensive discussions with the Chinese side over months. So we know this was a very important part of the discussions during Xi's visit, and I assume it was also a very big part of the discussion between Scholz and Xi when the German chancellor was in Beijing. I think it's going to be at the heart of the G7 discussions as well, because we know that the U.S. has warned publicly that it could consider sanctioning Chinese banks, which would really be a sort of a ratcheting up of the response to this. I think in Europe, I would say at the Commission, there's a great deal of concern about this, and I think in all European capitals, but there's also, if you look at Berlin, for example, there's also a great deal of concern about the implications of this and what it means in terms of tougher sanctions, right? And creating a sort of escalatory dynamic with China. So while there is a great deal of concern about this, my feeling is that it's quite worrying that this debate is kind of being brushed under the carpet to a certain extent. So I don't see the readiness right now of the big European capitals to sort of ratchet up the sanctions to a new level. But that I think we're going to get more clarity on that over the coming months as we, I think Europe and the US will be monitoring whether these conversations with Xi have had any effect on the flows of dual-use goods into Russia. And if not, then there's going to have to be a discussion at G7 level. I think that is already going on about tougher sanctions.
And you think those conversations are going to go on either way at the G7?
Well, I think those conversations are already taking place. Yeah. And the question is, what kind of signal does the G7 summit send on this? But more importantly, are Europeans at some point, is there a red line where they say, we're going to move with the US and ratchet up the sanctions?
Yeah, okay. That's a perfect segue, actually, because the last question that I want to ask about is the United States, to bring us back to US-China relations in keeping with the National Committee's mandate. This is open to either one of you, whoever wants to jump in, or both of you. I'd be thrilled to hear your thoughts on this. And we could take more time than we have probably delving into it. But obviously, the US presidential election is coming up in November. This is a source of some uncertainty, perhaps, in the transatlantic relationship, the outcome of the election, but also the political cycles as well, and how those can affect the transatlantic relationship. So how are different member states preparing for potential contingencies and changes in US policy with respect to China, but also in the transatlantic relationship? Do you have a sense of that or any insights there?
Well, Janka spent her formative years in Alabama, so I think she has a better sense than I do of sort of the how the heartland of the U.S. Thinks about these things. So I will defer to you, Janka.
I think it's astonishing that you can't hear it anymore, but obviously Noah's right. So I think what we are looking at the moment is a situation in which the Europeans are talking about preparing for what's coming, but not really knowing what to prepare for, because the situation is really complicated. So I think what is happening is a sense of panic everywhere, particularly obviously with regard to US defense commitments to Europe, US defense commitments when it comes to NATO, and US financial and military support to Ukraine. That's the largest threat. That's the biggest concern. And that's much bigger than any kind of China policy concerns that are featuring. And there is a level of sort of baked in stuff. Things that we've seen in the first Trump administration that one can actually get ready for. So everyone has sort of baked in that there will be then larger tariffs. That's sort of something that probably wouldn't even surprise anyone, which would then also kind of be reflected in the reactions that you can get to that. So it's sort of, that's the more expected pattern. And then there is this dimension of no one knows exactly how a second Trump administration would operate. And I don't think anyone in the US knows how a second Trump administration would operate. So we can spend a lot of time talking to the people that write for the respective think tanks on each side. But I think what's really important is that either president that comes in November, after the November elections next January, will need a European response, or a Europe that is stronger, more sovereign, more capable of dealing with its own problems, and more capable of kind of defending itself physically, but also kind of sticking up to its own for its own needs in the China relationship. And I think that's something where it's actually then pretty basic in how you prepare for this, is by kind of closing the gaps on your defense infrastructure at the moment, by making sure that you spend enough money on Ukraine, by making sure that you kind of ramp up your defenses when it comes to China's trade, the distortions that are created by China's trade practices, that you ramp up European unity, that you create a commission that is strong enough to actually deal with all of these questions with capable personnel. Now, these are all things that is incredibly difficult for the Europeans to do, but it doesn't matter whether it's going to be Biden or Trump in the White House. That will be the right things to do. That will strengthen the transatlantic partnership, or at least avoid a further deterioration under a Trump administration, if there is some goodwill shown on the European side to actually take care of their own matters. So I think it is in one way incredibly complicated, but on the other hand, super banal, because we actually know what we would need to do to, at the moment, kind of have the right steps in motion and get that done. The question is whether we can get it done before a new Trump administration, or whether we will then have to scramble once it's in place. Because I do think that it was, for us, a very important moment when Biden came into office, that we didn't have a plan for the Biden administration. I don't think we have a really good plan for day one of Biden 2. I don't think we have a plan that we could put on the table immediately that says this is exactly how we're going to structure things together to kind of enhance transatlantic appeal in the world as well. Are we going to approach other countries in terms of kind of creating what we want in terms of a kind of liberal trading order, in terms of a liberal international order, defending values, defending rules, etc. I don't think we have much of that at the moment, because everyone is sort of busy dealing with today's problems and not with tomorrow's. And quite frankly, I can't blame European policymakers to feel a little bit overwhelmed with the challenges that they're facing at the moment. This is kind of coming from all sides, plus economic troubles that it creates. But that is what would be required.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Unfortunately, so much more to say, but that's all we have time for. I do want to thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and insights and for such a great conversation today. I also, before we go, want to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who did all the work to put this conversation together and made the interviews possible today. We hope those of you who tuned in and who listened found this both interesting and informative, and we hope that you'll join us for future National Committee programming in the days ahead. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Jason.